Jung taught us that the path to emotional healing begins when we dare to prioritize ourselves in a world that constantly pushes us to look outward, to seek validation from others and fit into molds that aren't our own. We rarely stop to ask ourselves, what do I truly want? What do I need to feel fulfilled? The answers to these questions aren't found in others' opinions or external approval, but in the deep connection with our own being. When you decide to prioritize yourself, it doesn't mean you're being selfish. On the contrary, it means you're finally paying attention to the most important person in your life, yourself. Jung warns us that many of our emotional wounds come from living in constant disconnection from our essence. We spend years molding ourselves to meet society's expectations, our family's expectations, our partner's expectations, to the point where we forget who we truly are. But here's the key: everything we repress, everything we deny about ourselves, doesn't disappear. It transforms into a shadow that, sooner or later, finds a way to manifest in our lives. Perhaps you've already noticed this in relationships that seem to repeat endlessly, in patterns of self-sabotage, or in a constant feeling of dissatisfaction. We wonder why life doesn't change, why we find ourselves trapped in the same conflicts, without realizing that the answer isn't out there, but within us. Jung teaches us that healing begins when we stop looking outside and dare to explore our own inner world. Think of your life as a reflection of your internal state. If you constantly surround yourself with people who don't value you, if you feel your energy is drained in toxic relationships or situations that don't nourish you, this isn't a coincidence. It's your unconscious showing you there's something inside you that needs care. The question is, are you willing to listen? Most people avoid this process because facing ourselves isn't easy. It means confronting our wounds, our insecurities, and accepting that often we ourselves allow pain to persist. But that's exactly where true transformation happens. When you prioritize yourself, you realize you can't heal if you continue surrounding yourself with what hurts you. Emotional healing doesn't occur in toxic environments. It doesn't happen when you keep allowing the same as always. Jung spoke about the importance of individuation, a process where we free ourselves from external influences to discover our own identity. This doesn't mean isolating yourself from the world, but stopping your dependence on it to define who you are. How many times have you felt your happiness depends on someone else's validation? How many times has fear of rejection prevented you from doing what you truly desire? When you begin to prioritize yourself, something changes within you. You no longer accept emotional crumbs. You no longer seek others to fill the voids that only you can heal. You realize you don't need to fit into a mold because what you really need is to connect with yourself. And when this happens, healing flows without barriers. The relationships that used to drain you begin to dissolve. Situations that used to affect you lose their power over you, not because the world has changed, but because you've changed. You've stopped looking outside for what has always been within you. And this is where true freedom emerges, when you understand that your well-being doesn't depend on anyone but yourself. But this process doesn't happen overnight. It requires courage. It requires patience. It means learning to say no, learning to establish boundaries, and above all, learning to listen to yourself. How many times have you ignored your intuition out of fear of disappointing others? How many times have you sacrificed your peace to please someone? Jung tells us that the price of ignoring ourselves is too high. We pay with anxiety, with fatigue, with a life that doesn't feel like our own. When you decide to prioritize yourself, you begin to notice something curious: the world no longer seems so chaotic. Relationships stop being a constant struggle. Why? Because you've stopped fighting against yourself. Emotional healing isn't a destination you reach, but a path you travel day after day. It's the act of choosing yourself repeatedly, without guilt, without fear. And when you finally do this, everything changes, not because the world has changed, but because you now see it through different eyes. The peace you sought outside has always been within you. You just needed to remember that you deserve more, that you deserve a life where you don't need permission to be who you are. This is just the beginning. Real transformation happens when you decide to take the first step, when you choose to leave behind what no longer resonates with you and allow yourself to discover who you truly are. It's not easy, but it's the only path to an authentic and fulfilled life. And the question is, are you ready to walk it? When you begin to prioritize yourself, you start to see more clearly the dynamics that previously went unnoticed. Suddenly, you notice that certain relationships only worked because you were the one making all the effort. That there were situations where you gave more than you received. That many times you endured the unbearable just out of fear of being alone. But when you decide to choose yourself, something inside you breaks, a necessary rupture, a crack through which the light of consciousness finally enters. Jung taught us that everything we repress finds a way to manifest in our lives, one way or another. If we don't listen to our needs, we end up projecting them onto others. If we deny recognizing our worth, we attract people who reinforce this belief. And if we avoid facing our wounds, the world will take care of reflecting them repeatedly until we decide to face them. This is the process many avoid because it's not comfortable. It means accepting that what we called love often wasn't love but attachment. That what we thought was friendship might have just been a connection based on convenience. And that the decisions we made were, most of the time, driven by the fear of not being enough. But here's the key, when you prioritize yourself, you stop conforming. You stop negotiating your peace. You stop sustaining the unsustainable. And then something happens that scares many. You begin to lose people. Not because you've changed, but because you've stopped tolerating what you used to accept. People who seemed essential to your life begin to distance themselves, some without even giving explanations. But what initially seems like a loss soon transforms into liberation, because for every door that closes, a space opens for something more authentic. This process, although necessary, isn't easy. The unconscious resists change because it seeks the security of the familiar. Even if the past was painful, it's still familiar, and the familiar gives us a false sense of control. That's why many people prefer to stay in situations that hurt them, in relationships that consume them, because the fear of the unknown seems greater than the suffering they already know. But that's exactly where true transformation occurs, when you dare to let go. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting overnight or pretending nothing matters. It means accepting that you can't force anyone to stay, that you can't make someone value you if they don't want to, and that the only person responsible for your well-being is yourself. At this point, the world divides into two types of people, those who continue seeking outside what they can only find within, and those who decide to face themselves and begin their own healing journey. Jung tells us that the path to wholeness isn't easy, but it's the only one worth taking. It's the path of authenticity, the path where you allow yourself to be who you truly are, without excuses or fear. When you decide to prioritize yourself, you begin to notice something powerful, the quality of your relationships changes. People who were in your life only out of interest distance themselves, and in their place begin to arrive those who truly value your presence, relationships where there's reciprocity, where affection isn't measured in sacrifices but in mutual support. Because when you value yourself, you stop accepting less than you deserve. The problem is that most people don't reach this point because the process of letting go is painful, not just because of the loss itself, but because it forces us to face the part of ourselves that allowed certain dynamics for so long. It's easier to blame others, to say that what's wrong is outside. But Jung reminds us that everything we experience is a reflection of our inner world, and until we do the work of healing from within, we'll continue repeating the same patterns. Here enters the concept of the shadow. Jung said that we all carry within us parts we don't want to recognize, fears, insecurities, hidden desires, emotions we suppress because we were told they weren't acceptable. But denying our shadow doesn't make it disappear. On the contrary, the more we ignore it, the more power it has over us. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you avoid it. It hides in the relationships you choose, in the conflicts you experience, in the emotions you can't control. When you prioritize yourself, you begin to make your shadow conscious. You begin to notice your own patterns, the ways you sabotage yourself, the times you say yes when you want to say no. And at this moment, you have two options: continue living in awareness or begin to take control of your life. This is the point where many stop, because facing the shadow is uncomfortable. It means recognizing that we allowed situations that hurt us, that we gave too much where we weren't valued, that we accepted less than we deserved. But here's the truth, the pain of facing reality is temporary. The pain of living in denial lasts a lifetime. The path to emotional healing begins when you decide to look at yourself with honesty, not from judgment, but from compassion. Jung said we can't heal what we don't recognize, we can't change what we're not willing to accept. But the moment you decide to face yourself directly, without masks, without excuses, something inside you changes. This is where true healing begins, when you stop looking for someone to blame and start taking your power back. When you realize that life doesn't just happen to you, but is created by each decision you make. When you understand that you don't need anyone's approval to live an authentic life. From this point on, transformation becomes inevitable. You begin to attract people and situations that reflect your new level of consciousness. You stop trying to fit where you never belonged. The anxiety about the future dissolves because you trust in your ability to navigate life from your truth. But the most beautiful thing of all is the peace that emerges when you finally choose yourself, that feeling of freedom you only experience when you no longer depend on anything external to feel complete. That certainty that everything you need is already within you. The question is, are you willing to go through this process? Are you ready to let go of what weighs you down and open yourself to the possibility of something better? It won't be easy, but I assure you it will be worth it. Because when you prioritize yourself, emotional healing flows without barriers, and the world stops seeming like a hostile place to become a reflection of your own well-being. When you begin to prioritize yourself, something inevitably happens, you change. And when you change, the people around you react. Some celebrate it, others question it, and some will try to make you feel guilty for no longer being the same person they knew. This is one of the most difficult moments in the process, because you'll realize that not everyone will be ready to accept your transformation. This is where many people retreat, returning to old habits, going back to relationships that don't fulfill them, accepting conditions that diminish them, all out of fear of losing the familiar. But here's the truth, if you need to reduce yourself to fit into someone's life, that place was never for you. Jung teaches us that individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, isn't a path everyone will understand. But it doesn't matter if others understand or not. What matters is if you're willing to move forward, even if it means walking alone for a while. The fear of loneliness is one of the biggest traps in personal growth. We've been taught to believe that being alone is synonymous with being incomplete, with being rejected, or with having failed at something. But the reality is that loneliness isn't the problem. The real problem is not knowing how to be with yourself. Jung said that the journey toward wholeness requires a period of deep introspection, where we stop looking outside for what we can only find within. And when we learn to be well in our own company, we stop accepting just anything to avoid the discomfort of silence. At this point, many people experience what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a transition period where everything old crumbles, but the new hasn't yet arrived. It's a void, a feeling of uncertainty where everything you thought was secure begins to collapse. And this is where most give up, because the mind seeks immediate answers. It wants certainties. It wants to hold on to something. But growth doesn't work that way. Real transformation happens when you allow yourself to be in this void without trying to fill it with the same old things. When you resist the temptation to return to the familiar just because it's comfortable. When, instead of seeking distractions, you decide to face what you truly feel. This is the moment when many discover that much of their identity was built around others, that their value depended on being needed, being accepted, being recognized. And when all these external expectations disappear, a big question emerges: who am I when no one else is watching? For Jung, the answer to this question lies in the integration of our complete being, not just the part we show to the world, but also our shadows, our wounds, our deepest truths. When you stop running from yourself, when you dare to look at your life honestly, something changes. The need to please disappears. The urgency to explain yourself dissolves. And for the first time, you begin to feel free. At this point, the world will test you. Situations from the past will return to see if you've really learned the lesson. Relationships you thought you'd overcome will knock at your door again. People who used to manipulate you will try to do so again. And this is where you'll know if you've really changed, not because the world seems different, but because now you respond differently. You no longer need to explain yourself. You no longer feel the obligation to convince anyone of your worth. You understand that not all connections are forever, and that losing some people isn't a tragedy but an act of alignment. The energy you used to spend trying to be enough for others, you now invest in yourself. And this, although it might seem strange at first, is the greatest act of self-love you can perform. When you prioritize yourself, you begin to notice patterns you previously ignored. You understand that life isn't a set of random events, but a mirror of your own consciousness. Everything you see outside is a reflection of what you carry within. Jung speaks of the principle of projection. What bothers us in others, what we admire or reject, is often a manifestation of aspects of ourselves we haven't yet recognized. If you constantly attract relationships where you feel undervalued, if you always end up in situations where you need to try too hard, ask yourself, what part of me still believes I'm not enough? Because the answer isn't in the external world, but in the relationship you have with yourself. When you do this inner work, something incredible happens. Life stops seeming like a struggle. Anxiety about the future dissolves because you trust in your ability to face any circumstance from your truth. Relationships stop being a source of conflict and become a space for mutual growth. And most importantly, you reclaim your power. This doesn't mean everything will be perfect, that you'll never feel fear or insecurity again. It means that now you have the tools not to let these emotions control you. And instead of acting from scarcity, you begin to act from abundance. Instead of desperately seeking love, you realize that love has always been within you. Jung taught us that life isn't about eliminating pain, but learning to integrate it. That true healing isn't escaping from our wounds, but embracing them and giving them new meaning. When you allow yourself to do this, you stop living in the past, stop worrying about the future, and begin to experience the only reality that truly matters, the present. This is where peace is found, not in the absence of problems, but in the certainty that whatever happens, you have the capacity to sustain yourself. Not in others' approval, but in the confidence that at the end of the day, you are enough as you are. This is the gift of prioritizing yourself. You not only reclaim your energy, your time, and your peace, but also something even more valuable, your authenticity. Because when you decide to stop being what the world expects of you and start being who you truly are, emotional healing flows without barriers, and life finally becomes the reflection of your own truth. When you finally decide to prioritize yourself, you realize that much of your suffering didn't come from the external world, but from the stories you tell yourself, stories that made you believe that to be loved, you needed to try harder. That to be accepted, you needed to adapt. That to be valued, you had to constantly prove your usefulness. But the moment you begin to question these beliefs, you see the truth clearly. It was never your responsibility to carry what doesn't belong to you. Jung taught us that the collective unconscious is filled with inherited patterns and beliefs that we often don't question, ideas about love, success, happiness, loyalty, sacrifice. All of this shapes us from a young age, and without realizing it, we end up repeating stories that aren't even ours. But awakening happens when you begin to ask yourself, why do I believe what I believe? Why do I continue sustaining dynamics that hurt me? Why do I keep tolerating the intolerable? This questioning is uncomfortable because it forces us to see that many of our choices weren't really ours, but the result of what we were taught to accept as normal. Perhaps you grew up seeing your parents sacrifice for others without receiving anything in return, and now you believe that love means giving everything, even if it costs you your peace. Maybe you were told that if you weren't productive, you had no value, and now you feel guilty every time you allow yourself to rest. Or perhaps you learned that being strong means enduring, and that's why it's so hard to let go, even when something no longer makes sense. But here's the truth, you can unlearn everything that limited you. You can choose new paths, new beliefs, new ways of relating to yourself and others. You aren't condemned to repeat the same stories forever. Jung tells us that destiny isn't something fixed, but the result of what we do with our consciousness. And when you decide to expand your consciousness, your reality changes. When you prioritize yourself, you realize that love shouldn't be a battle. That peace shouldn't be an unattainable goal. That happiness shouldn't depend on external factors. That you don't need to prove your worth because the simple fact of existing is enough. And this is where true transformation begins. People who used to have power over you lose control. Situations that used to affect you no longer have the same weight, not because the world has changed, but because you've changed how you relate to it. You stop trying to be understood by those who never tried to understand you. You stop trying to fit where you were never welcome. You stop insisting on saving what is clearly meant to stay in the past. This is freedom, not the false freedom of doing whatever you want without consequences, but the inner freedom of knowing you don't need anything outside yourself to feel complete. The security of knowing you can be alone without feeling empty. The certainty that whatever happens, you'll always be okay because you've finally learned to be with yourself. Jung said that individuation is the most important process of our existence. It's the path to integration, to wholeness. And although this path often involves pain, loss, and loneliness, it's the only one that can lead us to a meaningful life. When you begin to prioritize yourself, when you decide to leave behind the old versions of yourself that only existed to please others, life rewards you in unexpected ways. New people enter your life. Opportunities that once seemed impossible begin to manifest. And above all, you experience a peace you've never felt before, because you've stopped fighting against yourself. You've stopped looking outside for what has always been within you. It's at this point that many feel they've finally awakened, that life is no longer about surviving or pleasing, but about experiencing, creating, feeling. About living from a place of authenticity rather than fear. But the work doesn't end here. Consciousness is like a muscle, it needs constant exercise. Because society, family, the environment will continue trying to pull you back into old dynamics. They'll continue trying to make you doubt yourself, make you feel you're being selfish for choosing yourself. But the difference is that now you know the truth. You know there's nothing more valuable than your peace, nothing more important than your well-being. And at the end of the day, the only decisions that truly matter are those that bring you closer to yourself. The world changes when you change. Relationships improve when you improve the relationship with yourself. Opportunities arrive when you stop acting from scarcity and begin acting from abundance. Jung tells us that the unconscious responds to our deepest beliefs, and when you truly believe you deserve something better, the universe takes care of showing you this. And the question is, are you ready to see? Are you ready to let go of everything that no longer resonates with you and open yourself to the possibility of something completely new? It won't be easy, but I promise you it will be worth it. Because when you finally decide to prioritize yourself, emotional healing flows without barriers, and your life becomes what it was always meant to be, a reflection of your own truth.